The December wind cut through Margaret Thompson's thin coat like glass shards as she stumbled toward the front steps of what used to be her home. Her knees buckled, sending her crashing onto the frozen concrete, her empty stomach cramping with a pain that made her gasp. At 72 years old, she had never imagined she would die alone and forgotten on the doorstep of the house where she had spent 30 years helping others. The foreclosure notice still hung on the door, its red letters bleeding in the winter rain. 3 days without food had left her weak and dizzy. The homeless shelter downtown was full, and pride had kept her from begging on street corners. This was how it would end. The woman who had fed thousands would starve within sight of her own kitchen window. Have you ever wondered what happens to those who spend their lives giving to others? If this story touches your heart, please subscribe and tell me in the comments. Do you think kindness always comes back to those who show it? Margaret's vision blurred as she pressed her palm against the cold door. She thought of all the meals she had served, all the families she had helped, all the children who had found hope in her community center. Where were they now when she needed them most? The irony tasted bitter in her mouth. Through her fading consciousness, she heard footsteps approaching on the sidewalk. 2 figures moved through the rain toward her, but Margaret was too weak to lift her head. This was not how she wanted to be found, broken and helpless after a lifetime of strength. But something about those footsteps sounded familiar, purposeful. They stopped right beside her, and gentle hands touched her shoulders. A woman's voice, soft but confident, spoke words that would change everything. "We found you, Margaret. We never stopped looking." 20 years earlier, on an equally cold morning in Denver, Colorado, Margaret had been making her way to the community soup kitchen, where she volunteered every Tuesday and Thursday. At 42, she was a single woman who worked as a school secretary, spending her free time serving meals to families who needed help. The kitchen operated out of the basement of Grace Methodist Church, where Pastor Richards had started the program 5 years before. That particular morning, Margaret noticed the supplies were running dangerously low. The usual donations had not come through, and they had maybe enough food for 50 people when they typically served over 100. Margaret made a quick decision that would echo through decades. She would give her own packed lunch to help stretch the meals. As she organized the serving line with Mrs. Patterson, another volunteer, Margaret spotted 2 children standing at the back of the crowd. The girl looked about 8 years old, with tangled brown hair and clothes that had seen too many washings. The boy beside her could not have been more than 6, his small hand gripping his sister's coat tightly. What struck Margaret most was how they stood apart from the adults, as if they did not quite belong but had nowhere else to go. Their eyes held awareness that children should never have to carry. When the line began moving, they hung back, letting everyone else go first. By the time the siblings reached the front, the last of the soup was being scraped from the bottom of the pot. Margaret looked at their thin faces and made another choice that would change multiple lives. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with her own turkey sandwich, apple, and homemade cookies. "This is for you too," she said, placing the bag in the girl's hands. "Make sure you both eat everything." The little girl looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "Are you sure, miss? This looks like your own lunch." Margaret knelt down to their level, her voice gentle but firm. "I am very sure. You two need it more than I do today." She paused, studying their faces. "What are your names?" "I'm Beth, and this is my little brother Tommy," the girl replied. "Our parents died in a car accident 3 months ago. We have been staying at different places, but—" Her voice trailed off. Tommy stepped closer to his sister, his small voice barely audible. "We do not have anywhere to go today. The people we were staying with had to move." Margaret felt her heart break and saw at the same time. These children were alone in the world, yet they had found their way to exactly where they needed to be. She looked around the emptying church basement, then back at the 2 small faces watching her with hope they were afraid to voice. "Well," Margaret said, standing up and brushing off her knees, "it just so happens I have a couch in a warm house not too far from here. Would you like to come home with me today?" The transformation in their faces was immediate. Beth's eyes filled with tears she quickly wiped away, while Tommy's grip on his sister's hand loosened for the first time since Margaret had noticed them. They nodded together, and Margaret knew that God had just used an empty soup pot to bring these children exactly where they belonged. Pastor Richards approached as Margaret was gathering her things. Margaret, are you sure about this? Taking in children is a big responsibility. Margaret looked at Beth and Tommy, who were sharing her sandwich at a nearby table, making sure each got exactly half. Pastor, some decisions make themselves. These children need help, and I have help to give. Sometimes that is all the certainty you need. As they walked to Margaret's old Honda Civic, Beth tugged on her coat sleeve. Miss Margaret, why did you give us your food? Were not you hungry too? Margaret opened the car door and helped them buckle their seatbelts before answering. Honey, there are different kinds of hungry. I was hungry for food, but you too were hungry for hope. Hope is more important than sandwiches. Tommy pressed his face against the window as they drove through downtown Denver toward Margaret's modest neighborhood. Will we get to stay with you for a long time? We will take it one day at a time, sweetie. But I promise you this, you will never be alone again if I have anything to say about it. Margaret caught Beth's eyes in the rearview mirror. The little girl was studying her with the intense focus of someone who had learned not to trust too quickly. Why are you helping us? You do not even know us. Beth, sometimes the most important people in our lives are the ones we have not met yet. Today, you and Tommy became important to me. That is just how kindness works. It decides for itself where it needs to go. As they pulled into Margaret's driveway, she said a silent prayer of gratitude. She had woken up that morning thinking she was just going to serve soup. Instead, she was about to discover that sometimes when you feed others, you end up feeding your own soul in ways you never expected. The house key turned easily in the lock, and Margaret ushered the children into the warmth of her small but comfortable home. Neither of them could have imagined that this simple act of sharing a lunch would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just their lives, but the lives of thousands of others over the next 20 years. Margaret's house on Maple Street was nothing fancy, a two-bedroom ranch with faded blue siding and a front porch that needed paint. But to Beth and Tommy, walking through the front door felt like entering a palace. The living room was filled with soft light from table lamps, comfortable furniture that matched, and family photos covering every surface. The bathroom is down the hall, and there are clean towels in the closet, Margaret said, hanging up their coats. Why do not you two get cleaned up while I make us some real food? Beth hesitated at the hallway entrance. Miss Margaret, what if someone comes looking for us? We do not want to get you in trouble. Margaret knelt down and took both children's hands in hers. Listen to me carefully. You are not in trouble, and neither am I. Tomorrow we will figure out all the official things that need figuring out. Tonight, you are safe, warm, and fed. That is all that matters right now. In the kitchen, Margaret pulled out ingredients for her grandmother's famous chicken and rice casserole. As she cooked, she could hear the children's voices drifting from the bathroom, Tommy asking his sister questions about soap, and Beth patiently explaining how to wash behind his ears properly. These were good children who had been taking care of each other for months. The thought of them sleeping in cold places, hungry and afraid, made Margaret's hands shake as she stirred the casserole. She had always believed that God put people in your path for a reason, but she had never felt that truth as strongly as she did right now. When Beth and Tommy emerged from their baths, wearing the oversized t-shirts Margaret had found for them, their faces looked years younger. Clean hair revealed that Beth had beautiful brown eyes that sparkled when she smiled, and Tommy had a gap-toothed grin that could melt ice. Something smells incredible, Beth said, settling Tommy into a chair at the kitchen table. My grandmother taught me this recipe when I was about your age, Margaret replied, serving generous portions. She always said that the secret ingredient was making sure everyone at the table felt loved. Tommy took his first bite and his eyes went wide. This is the best food I have ever tasted. He paused, fork halfway to his mouth. Miss Margaret, do you have children of your own? Margaret set down her own fork, choosing her words carefully. No, sweetie. I never got married or had babies. But maybe that was because God was saving room in my life for children who needed extra love. After dinner, Margaret set up the living room with blankets and pillows, creating a cozy nest on the couch and floor. We can figure out better sleeping arrangements tomorrow, but this will work for tonight. As she tucked them in, Beth grabbed her hand. Miss Margaret, what happens to us now? The social workers keep saying they are looking for family members, but our parents did not have any brothers or sisters. Tomorrow I will make some phone calls and we will figure out the best plan, Margaret said, brushing Beth's hair back from her forehead. But whatever happens, I want you to remember something. You two are special. You have taken care of each other through the hardest thing that can happen to children, and that makes you both very strong. Tommy's small voice piped up from his pile of blankets. Will you tell us a story? Our mom used to tell us stories about brave princes and princesses. Margaret settled into her recliner and thought for a moment. Let me tell you about two of the bravest kids I know. Once upon a time, there was a sister and brother who had to go on a very difficult journey. They did not know where they were going or how long it would take, but they held each other's hands and promised never to give up. As she spun the tale of two children who discovered that their kindness and love for each other was actually magic that helped everyone they met, Margaret watched their eyelids grow heavy. By the time the story children found their happy ending, both Beth and Tommy were sleeping peacefully, and the sound of children's laughter filled every room. Margaret had never realized how empty her life had been until it became full. The children had settled into routines that felt natural and right. Beth helped with cooking, displaying a talent for making perfect pancakes that amazed Margaret. Tommy appointed himself the official house helper, following Margaret around with a toy toolbox, fixing everything that looked like it might need attention. Miss Margaret, why do you go to that soup kitchen so much? Beth asked one Thursday morning as they walked to Grace Methodist Church together. Margaret had decided to bring the children along, so they would not have to stay with a babysitter. Well, there are families in our city who do not have enough food, Margaret explained, holding Tommy's hand as they crossed the street. The church opens its doors twice a week, so those families can get a hot meal. Tommy skipped alongside them, his small face serious with thought. Like we did not have enough food before we met you. Exactly like that, sweetie. Pastor Richards greeted them warmly at the church entrance. Well, look who brought some helpers today. He knelt down to Beth and Tommy's level. Would you two like to help Miss Margaret serve meals today? Both children nodded eagerly, and Margaret felt a swell of pride watching them put on aprons that dragged on the floor. Mrs. Patterson showed Beth how to arrange rolls in baskets while Margaret taught Tommy to carefully carry cups of juice to tables. As the morning progressed, Margaret noticed something remarkable happening. Beth, who was still shy around most adults, began talking easily with the other children who came through the line. She helped a little boy about Tommy's age fix his shoelaces and shared her hair ribbon with a girl whose ponytail had come loose. Tommy appointed himself the official welcomer, greeting every person with a gap-toothed smile and the words, "We are glad you came today." His enthusiasm was so genuine that even the most tired-looking adults found themselves smiling back. Those children have servants' hearts, Pastor Richards observed, watching Tommy help an elderly man find a seat. They understand what it means to have been helped, so they want to help others. Margaret nodded, her throat tight with emotion. They are the most generous people I have ever known. After the lunch service ended and they had finished cleaning up, Margaret, Beth, and Tommy walked through downtown Denver. The children were full of questions about the people they had met, wondering about their stories and whether they had safe places to sleep. Miss Margaret, Beth said as they passed a small park, what if we never find a family that wants both of us? What if Tommy and I have to live in different places? Margaret stopped walking and turned to face both children. This conversation had been weighing on her heart for days, especially after Linda Morrison's latest update about the interested families. Beth, Tommy, I want you to listen to me very carefully, Margaret said, guiding them to a bench under a large oak tree. Whatever happens with families and where you live, you two will always be brother and sister. Nothing can change that. But what if we cannot see each other? Tommy asked, his eyes filling with tears. Margaret took both their hands in hers. Then we will make sure you can. I will drive you to visit each other every week if I have to. I will make sure your new families understand how important you are to each other. Beth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. And what if we forget each other when we grow up? Oh, sweetheart, Margaret said, pulling them both into a hug. Love does not work that way. Real love grows stronger over time, not weaker. 20 years from now, you will still be the most important person in Tommy's life, and he will still be the most important person in yours. Will we remember you too? Tommy asked in a small voice. Margaret felt her heart break and heal at the same time. I hope so, little one. But even if you forget my name or my face, I hope you will remember how it felt to be loved. And I hope you will love others the same way. That afternoon brought news that Margaret had been dreading. Linda Morrison called to say that one of the families interested in Beth had been approved for adoption and wanted to meet her as soon as possible. The family lived in Colorado Springs, about an hour south of Denver. What about Tommy? Margaret asked, though she feared the answer. We are still working on placement for him. The family in Aurora is interested, but wants to meet him first before making any commitments. Margaret hung up the phone and stared out her kitchen window at Beth and Tommy playing in the backyard. Beth was pushing her little brother on the swing set, and their laughter drifted through the glass like music. How could she explain to them that their time together might be ending? That evening, after the children were asleep, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and tried to process her emotions. In just 3 weeks, these children had become the center of her world. The thought of her house returning to its previous quiet emptiness felt unbearable. But this was not about her feelings. This was about 2 children who deserved permanent families, stable futures, and all the love the world had to offer. If she truly loved them, she would do everything possible to help them find those things, even if it meant letting them go. The next morning, Margaret decided to have an honest conversation with Beth and Tommy about what might happen next. She found them in the living room, building an elaborate castle out of couch cushions and blankets. Can we talk for a few minutes? Margaret asked, settling cross-legged on the floor beside their fort. Both children immediately stopped playing and gave her their full attention. After 3 weeks together, they had learned to read the tone in Margaret's voice. There's a family in Colorado Springs who would like to meet you, Beth, Margaret said gently. They have been hoping to adopt a little girl, and they think you might be a perfect fit for their family. Beth's face went very still. Just me? Not Tommy too? Just you, sweetheart. But there's also a family in Aurora who is interested in meeting Tommy. Tommy crawled out of the blanket fort and climbed into Margaret's lap. Does that mean we have to leave you? Margaret stroked his hair, choosing her words carefully. It means that there are families out there who want to love you forever. That is a wonderful thing, even though it feels scary right now. When do we have to meet them? Beth asked, her voice very small. This weekend. But remember, meeting them does not mean anything is decided yet. Everyone just wants to see if you would be happy together. Beth and Tommy looked at each other with the silent communication that only siblings share. Finally, Beth spoke for both of them. Miss Margaret, whatever happens, we want you to know that these have been the best weeks of our whole lives. Before we came to live with you, we were scared all the time. Now we feel brave. Why do you feel brave? Margaret asked. Tommy answered first. Because you taught us that there are good people in the world who help kids like us. And you taught us that when someone is kind to you, you should be kind to other people too, Beth added. Like at the soup kitchen today. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. You two are the kindest people I know. Whatever families you end up with will be so lucky to have you. That weekend brought meetings with both potential families. The Hendersons in Colorado Springs were a young couple who had been trying to have children for years. They had a beautiful home with a room already decorated for a little girl, complete with a canopy bed and shelves full of books. Beth was polite but quiet during the visit, answering their questions carefully and accepting their offer to show her the room that could be hers. When they returned to Denver that evening, she sat silently in the car until they pulled into Margaret's driveway. They seem very nice, Margaret said gently. They are, Beth agreed. They really want a daughter to love. But Beth turned to look at Margaret with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her 8 years. They do not understand about Tommy and me. When I told them we take care of each other, they said I would not need to worry about that anymore because they would take care of me. Margaret nodded, understanding exactly what Beth meant. The Hendersons saw her as a single child who needed saving, not as half of a sibling pair who had survived together. The meeting with Tommy's potential family the next day went similarly. The Garcias were wonderful people with 2 older children of their own, but they clearly viewed Tommy as a little boy who needed big brothers, not as someone who already had the most important relationship of his life with his sister. Sunday evening found all three of them back in Margaret's living room, surrounded by the couch cushion fort that was beginning to feel like a symbol of their temporary but perfect family. "Miss Margaret," Beth said, "what if we asked to stay with you instead? Could you adopt us?" Margaret had been wondering the same thing for days, but she had researched the requirements and knew the truth would hurt. "Sweetheart, I would love nothing more in the world. But adoption costs a lot of money, and single people have to wait much longer for approval. You two deserve families now, not in 2 years when the paperwork finally goes through." "But you are our family," Tommy said, snuggling closer to her on the couch. "I will always be your family in my heart," Margaret replied. "But I want you to have parents who can give you everything: college educations, family vacations, brothers and sisters, everything I cannot provide on my own." 3 days later, Linda Morrison called with the news Margaret had been expecting but dreading. Both families had formally requested to move forward with adoption procedures. "The good news is that both families have agreed to maintain contact between Beth and Tommy," Linda explained. "Colorado Springs is not that far from Aurora, maybe an hour and a half drive. They could see each other regularly." "What about contact with me?" Margaret asked. "That will depend on the adoptive families. Most prefer a clean break to help the children bond with their new parents." Margaret closed her eyes and made peace with the possibility that she might never see Beth and Tommy again after the placement. If that was what was best for them, she could live with a broken heart. The final week passed too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Margaret took pictures of everything: the children helping in the kitchen, building forts, reading stories, sleeping peacefully on their makeshift beds. She wanted to remember every moment of the time when her house had felt like a real home. The night before the placements, Margaret tucked both children into their blanket nest one last time. "I want you both to promise me something," she said, kneeling beside the couch. "Anything," Beth said immediately. "Promise me that you will remember how loved you are. And promise me that you will look for ways to help other people the way we helped each other." "We promise," Tommy said solemnly. "And promise me that if you ever need anything at all, you will find a way to contact me. I will always be here for you." Both children nodded, tears streaming down their faces. "One more thing," Margaret said, pulling 2 small wrapped packages from behind her back. "These are for you to keep, so you will always remember this time we had together." Beth unwrapped a small silver locket with a picture of the 3 of them inside. Tommy's gift was a toy car, not just any toy car, but the red convertible he had been playing with the morning Margaret first brought them home from the soup kitchen. "We will keep these forever," Beth whispered. "And we will find you again someday," Tommy added with the absolute certainty that only children possess. Margaret kissed both their foreheads and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the privilege of loving them, even briefly. Neither she nor the children knew that Tommy's childish promise would prove to be prophetic, or that the seeds of kindness planted in those 3 precious weeks would grow into something that would change hundreds of lives. Sometimes the shortest chapters in our stories plant the seeds for the most beautiful endings. Margaret's house felt impossibly quiet after Beth and Tommy left. The silence pressed against her ears like a physical thing, broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock and the hum of the refrigerator. She found herself setting 3 places at the table before remembering she was alone again, and she kept extra blankets folded on the living room couch long after the children's makeshift beds had been put away. Linda Morrison had promised to call with updates about how the children were adjusting to their new families, but the phone remained silent for 2 weeks. When it finally rang on a Tuesday evening, Margaret nearly knocked over her teacup rushing to answer it. "Both children are doing well," Linda reported, though her tone suggested some complications. "Beth has been quiet but cooperative with the Hendersons. Tommy is more outgoing with the Garcias, but both children ask about each other constantly. Are the families allowing them to visit each other? That is where things get complicated. The Hendersons think it would be better for Beth to focus on bonding with them before reconnecting with her past. The Garcias are more open to visits, but they want to wait a few months for Tommy to settle in." Margaret gripped the phone tighter. "Linda, those children need each other. They have been through trauma that most adults could not handle, and they survived by staying together. I understand your concern, but both families are following the advice of their adoption counselors. The theory is that maintaining old attachments can interfere with forming new ones. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her kitchen staring at the photos of Beth and Tommy that she had pinned to the bulletin board beside the refrigerator. The theory might make sense to counselors who had never watched these specific children take care of each other through impossible circumstances, but Margaret knew in her heart that separating them was wrong. Unable to sit still with her worry, Margaret drove to Grace Methodist Church where Pastor Richards was preparing for Wednesday evening service. She found him in the fellowship hall, arranging chairs in a circle for the Bible study group. "Margaret, you look troubled," he said, setting down a stack of hymnals. "Is everything all right?" She told him about Beth and Tommy's placements and her concerns about keeping the siblings apart during their crucial adjustment period. Pastor Richards listened with the patience of someone who had counseled families through countless difficult situations. "It sounds like you are carrying a burden that is not yours to carry," he said gently. "You did everything you could for those children. Now you have to trust that God will work through their new families." "But what if the families are wrong? What if Beth and Tommy need each other more than they need time to adjust?" Pastor Richards was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Margaret, let me ask you something. What are you going to do with all the love you discovered you had for those children? Are you going to let it sit in your heart like a treasure you can only look at, or are you going to find ways to share it with others who need it?" The question hit Margaret like a revelation. She had been so focused on missing Beth and Tommy that she had not considered how the experience of loving them had changed her. 3 weeks of being needed, of having a purpose beyond her own daily routine, had awakened something in her that felt essential. "There are other children who need help," she said slowly. "There are indeed. And there are other families struggling to keep food on their tables and roofs over their heads. The soup kitchen feeds people twice a week, but hunger happens every day." Margaret drove home that night with her mind spinning with possibilities. She had a stable job, a house with extra room, and now she had experience with children who needed temporary care. More importantly, she had discovered that her heart was much bigger than she had ever imagined. Over the next few months, Margaret began fostering children on an emergency basis, kids who needed a safe place to stay for a few days or weeks while social services worked out longer-term placements. Her house filled with a rotating cast of children of all ages, each carrying their own stories of loss and hope. There was Maria, a 10-year-old whose grandmother had been hospitalized and who needed somewhere to stay during the 2 weeks it took to locate an aunt in Texas. Margaret helped Maria practice her English and taught her to make chocolate chip cookies from scratch. Then came the Johnson siblings, 3 brothers aged 5, 7, and 9 whose father was in jail and whose mother was in rehabilitation. They stayed for 6 weeks, and Margaret watched them transform from angry, suspicious children into kids who felt safe enough to laugh and play again. Each child who passed through Margaret's home left her with new insights about resilience, hope, and the incredible capacity of young people to heal when given love and stability. But more importantly, each child reinforced her growing belief that temporary love could have permanent impact. A year after Beth and Tommy's placement, Margaret made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She used her savings to make a down payment on a larger house in a neighborhood where many struggling families lived. The house had 5 bedrooms, a big kitchen, and a basement that could be converted into a community meeting space. "Are you sure about this?" asked Janet Miller, the real estate agent, as they signed the final papers. "This is a big house for one person." "I am not planning to live here alone," Margaret replied, accepting the keys with hands that shook slightly from excitement. "I am planning to fill it with people who need a home." With Pastor Richard's help and blessing from the Methodist Conference, Margaret established the Maple Street Community Center in the basement of her new home. 3 nights a week, the space served hot dinners to any family that needed them. The other nights, it offered homework help, job search assistance, and parenting classes. Upstairs, Margaret continued fostering children while also providing temporary housing for families in crisis, mothers fleeing domestic violence, families who had been evicted and needed time to find new apartments, elderly neighbors who could not afford both rent and medical bills. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking, but Margaret had never felt more alive. Each person who found help through the center reinforced a belief that everyone deserved a second chance, and that small acts of kindness could create ripple effects that touched countless lives. Mrs. Patterson from the original soup kitchen became Margaret's closest partner in running the center. "Margaret Thompson, you have lost your mind," she said fondly one evening as they cleaned up after serving dinner to 43 people. "This place is chaos most of the time." "Beautiful chaos," Margaret corrected, hanging up her apron. "Did you see how excited little Carlos was about his homework tonight? His mom said he has been struggling in school since they became homeless, but tonight he finished his math worksheet without any help." "And did you see Mrs. Henderson finally smile?" Mrs. Patterson added. 6 months of coming here for meals, and tonight was the first time she looked hopeful instead of defeated. Stories like these sustained Margaret through the difficult moments, and there were many difficult moments. Funding was always tight. Some families took advantage of her generosity, and the physical demands of running the center while working full-time and fostering children pushed her to her limits. But just when Margaret felt most overwhelmed, something would happen to remind her why the work mattered. A mother would find a job through connections made at the center. A teenager would graduate high school despite living in temporary housing. A family would move into their own apartment and bring Margaret a homemade cake to celebrate. 5 years after opening the center, Margaret was recognized by the Denver mayor for her community service. The ceremony was held in the city council chambers, and Margaret was surprised to see how many people came to support her: former foster children who were now adults, families who had found help through the center, volunteers who had been inspired by her work to start their own charitable efforts. "Margaret Thompson represents the best of our community," the mayor said during the presentation. "She saw a need and she filled it, not because it was her job or because she was asked to, but because she understood that we are all responsible for taking care of each other." As Margaret accepted the plaque, she thought about Beth and Tommy. She had received occasional updates through Linda Morrison. Both children were doing well in school, both had been officially adopted, and both were thriving in their new families. The updates never mentioned whether they had been able to maintain contact with each other, and Margaret tried not to let that worry consume her. Standing at the podium, looking out at the faces of people whose lives had been touched by the center in some way, Margaret felt a deep satisfaction. She had not been able to keep Beth and Tommy together, but she had created a place where other families could stay together during their hardest times. "I want to thank everyone who has supported the Maple Street Community Center," Margaret said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "But mostly, I want to thank the families who have trusted us with their stories. You have taught me that hope is not about avoiding difficulties. Hope is about believing that difficulties are temporary and that there are always people willing to help you through them." After the ceremony, Margaret drove home to find 3 families waiting in her driveway: a mother with twin babies who had been evicted that morning, an elderly man whose apartment had been damaged in a fire, and a teenage girl who had aged out of foster care and had nowhere to go. Margaret smiled as she unlocked the front door. "Well, come on in. Let us figure out how to help everyone get settled." As she served leftover casserole and found clean sheets for temporary beds, Margaret said a silent prayer of gratitude. She had learned that family was not just about who you were born to or who adopted you. Family was about who showed up when you needed them most. She had no way of knowing that 200 miles away, a successful businessman was telling his wife about a newspaper article he had read about a community center in Denver, or that a young medical student was researching volunteer opportunities and had bookmarked the Maple Street Community Center's website. The seeds of kindness that Margaret had planted with a shared turkey sandwich 15 years earlier were about to bloom in ways she could never have imagined. By her 60th birthday, Margaret had built something remarkable. The Maple Street Community Center was serving over 300 families a year, providing everything from emergency housing to job training to after-school programs for children. Margaret's house was perpetually full of people in transition, some staying for days, others for months, all finding the stability they needed to rebuild their lives. But success had come at a cost that Margaret had not anticipated. The constant expenses of running the center had slowly drained her personal savings. Property taxes on the large house kept rising. Utility bills for heating and air conditioning a space that housed dozens of people monthly were astronomical, and food costs for the community dinners had tripled as word spread about the center's services. "Margaret, we need to talk about the finances," said David Chen, the accountant who volunteered to handle the center's books. He spread a stack of papers across Margaret's kitchen table on a cold February morning. "The donations are not keeping up with the expenses." Margaret poured him a cup of coffee and sat down to face numbers she had been avoiding for months. How bad is it, David? You are running about $3,000 in the red every month. You have been covering the shortfall with your own money, but your personal savings are almost gone. The reality hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had been so focused on helping others that she had not paid attention to her own financial situation until it was nearly too late. What are my options? She asked quietly. David adjusted his glasses and pointed to different columns of figures. You could reduce services, maybe cut the community dinners down to once a week instead of 3 times, limit the number of families you house at one time. That means turning away people who need help. Or you could launch a serious fundraising campaign. Apply for grants, organize charity events, reach out to local businesses for regular donations. Margaret had always resisted aggressive fundraising, believing that the work should speak for itself and that people would support it if they saw the value. But her quiet approach was no longer sufficient for the scope of what the center had become. There is a third option, David continued reluctantly. You could sell the house and find a smaller space. This house is not just where the center operates, Margaret said, her voice tight. It is home to whoever needs it. Moving would mean starting over completely. Over the next 6 months, Margaret threw herself into fundraising with the same dedication she had always brought to direct service. She wrote grant applications, organized bake sales and silent auctions, and spoke at community meetings and church services throughout Denver. Some efforts were successful. A local grocery chain began donating day-old bread and produce, and the Methodist Conference provided a small monthly grant. But the major funding sources that could make a real difference remained elusive. Margaret's health began to suffer from the stress and overwork. She had always been strong and energetic, but now she found herself exhausted by mid-afternoon and struggling with headaches that medicine could not touch. Her doctor, Sarah Harrison, was blunt during Margaret's annual checkup. Your blood pressure is too high, you have lost weight you could not afford to lose, and you look like you have not slept well in months, Dr. Harrison said, reviewing Margaret's test results. Margaret, you cannot take care of everyone else if you do not take care of yourself. I just need to get through this financial crisis, Margaret replied. Once the center is stable, I can rest. What happens to all those people you are helping if you collapse? You need to find a way to reduce your stress level before it kills you. But reducing stress felt impossible when Margaret was turning away families almost daily because the center was operating at capacity. Every person she could not help felt like a personal failure, a betrayal of the mission she had built her life around. The crisis came to a head on a rainy Thursday evening in November. Margaret was serving dinner to 37 people when she felt a sharp pain in her chest that took her breath away. She gripped the edge of the serving table, trying to steady herself, but the room began to spin. Mrs. Patterson, who had been volunteering at the center for 8 years, immediately recognized the signs. Someone call an ambulance, she shouted, helping Margaret into a chair. Right now. As paramedics loaded Margaret into the ambulance, she could see the faces of people she had been feeding pressed against the community center windows. Children she had housed, mothers she had counseled, elderly neighbors who depended on the center for their only hot meals of the week, all of them watching their anchor being taken away. Margaret spent 3 days in the hospital recovering from what doctors determined was severe exhaustion complicated by a minor heart episode. The enforced rest gave her time to think clearly about the center's situation for the first time in months. David Chen visited on the 2nd day, with more devastating news. While you were in the hospital, the bank called about the mortgage. You are 4 months behind on payments. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of failure settle on her chest. How long do we have? They initiated foreclosure proceedings yesterday. Unless you can bring the payments current within 30 days, they will sell the house. How much would that take? $12,000, plus penalties and fees. Call it $15,000 to be safe. Margaret had exactly $437 in her personal checking account. The center's account had enough to cover groceries for the next week's community dinners, and that was all. David, I need you to help me with something, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. I need to find homes for all the people currently staying at the center, and I need to arrange for other organizations to take over our services. Margaret, You are not thinking clearly. This is just a financial crisis, not the end of everything you have built. Look at me, David. Really look at me. Margaret gestured to the hospital room around them. I am 70 years old. I have no savings. I am facing foreclosure, and my body is telling me I cannot continue at this pace. It is time to accept that I cannot do this anymore. Word of Margaret's hospitalization and the center's financial crisis spread quickly through the community. Former clients, volunteers, and supporters began gathering in the hospital lobby, offering whatever help they could provide. But individual donations of $20 or $50, while deeply meaningful, could not solve a $15,000 problem. Pastor Richards visited on Margaret's final day in the hospital. I have been making phone calls, he said, settling into the chair beside her bed. The Methodist Conference is willing to take over operation of the community center if we can resolve the mortgage issue. That is wonderful news, Margaret said, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. The work will continue even if I cannot. But Margaret, there is something else. The conference would want to make significant changes, reduce the housing program, limit the community dinners, focus more on traditional social services. Margaret understood what Pastor Richards was not saying directly. The intensely personal, family-style approach that had made the center special would be lost in favor of more efficient, but less intimate service delivery. That evening, alone in her hospital room, Margaret faced the hardest truth of her life. She had poured everything she had, financially, physically, and emotionally, into building something beautiful. But beautiful was not always sustainable, and sustainable was what the people depending on the center needed most. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret worked with social services to find alternative housing for the 7 families currently staying in her house. She coordinated with other agencies to ensure that the most vulnerable people would continue receiving help. She said goodbye to volunteers who had become like family and to clients who had trusted her with their deepest needs. The day before the foreclosure sale, Margaret walked through every room of the house that had been home to hundreds of people over the past 15 years. The kitchen where she had served countless meals, the bedrooms where children had slept safely, the basement community room where families had found hope during their darkest times. All of it would soon belong to someone else. In the master bedroom that had been hers, Margaret packed her belongings into boxes that fit easily into her small sedan. At 70 years old, after dedicating her life to helping others, she was starting over with nothing but Social Security benefits and the knowledge that she had made a difference. Margaret's final night in the house was spent on an air mattress in the living room, surrounded by the echoes of all the life that had filled these rooms. As she lay in the darkness, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for every person who had trusted her with their story and every moment she had been privileged to serve. She had no way of knowing that 500 miles away, a successful doctor was reading a newspaper article about the closing of the Maple Street Community Center, or that a businessman was researching the address of a woman named Margaret Thompson, who had once given him half of her turkey sandwich on the coldest day of his childhood. Sometimes our greatest failures plant the seeds for miracles we cannot yet imagine. Margaret's new apartment was a studio on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. The elevator worked sporadically, the radiator clanged all night, and her single window looked out onto an alley where trash bins overflowed every Tuesday. But it was what she could afford on Social Security benefits, and Margaret had learned long ago that gratitude was a choice, not a circumstance. The transition from running a bustling community center to living alone in silence was harder than she had anticipated. Margaret would wake up each morning reaching for her to-do list of people to help and meals to plan, only to remember that her days of service were over. The purposelessness felt heavier than any physical burden she had ever carried. Her health continued to decline in ways both subtle and obvious. The heart episode in the hospital had been a warning she could not ignore, but her doctor visits revealed a cascade of other issues: arthritis that made her hands ache constantly, blood pressure that medication could not fully control, and a persistent fatigue that sleep could not cure. Margaret, you need to consider assisted living, Dr. Harrison said gently during a checkup 6 months after the foreclosure. Living alone is not safe for someone with your health concerns. I cannot afford assisted living on my income, Margaret replied, though she had already researched the costs and knew the truth was even worse than her doctor suspected. There are programs for people in your situation. subsidized senior housing, Medicaid assistance for care services. The words stung more than Margaret let show. After a lifetime of helping others navigate social services, she was now the one who needed help navigating systems designed for people with nowhere else to turn. Margaret's days developed a routine born of necessity rather than choice. She walked to the grocery store twice a week, buying only what she could carry up 3 flights of stairs. She had learned to make meals from whatever was cheapest, pasta with butter, soup from cans, sandwiches when bread was on sale. The isolation was the hardest part. Margaret had spent 15 years surrounded by people who needed her, and now she could go days without speaking to another human, being beyond polite greetings with her neighbors. The silence in her apartment felt suffocating after decades of homes filled with conversation, laughter, and the comfortable noise of families living together. One evening in December, almost a year after losing the center, Margaret was walking home from the laundromat when she recognized a familiar face on the street corner. Maria Santos had been one of the last families to stay at the center before its closing, a mother with 3 young children who had been evicted from their apartment when Maria lost her job at a restaurant that closed suddenly. "Miss Margaret." Maria's voice was hesitant, as if she was not sure she should approach. "Maria, how wonderful to see you." Margaret set down her laundry bag and gave the younger woman a hug. "How are you and the children doing?" "We are managing," Maria said, though her clothes were thinner than they should be for December weather, and her face showed the stress of ongoing struggle. "We found a place to stay, but it is not permanent. I wanted to thank you again for helping us when we had nowhere to go." "You do not need to thank me. I am just glad I was able to help when you needed it." Maria glanced around the street corner where they stood, taking in the rundown buildings and vacant storefronts. "Miss Margaret, what happened to the center? People keep asking me, but I do not know what to tell them." Margaret chose her words carefully, not wanting to burden Maria with her own problems. "I was not able to keep up with the expenses. But other organizations are still helping families. The Methodist Church has expanded their programs, and Catholic Charities has more resources than I ever did." "It is not the same," Maria said quietly. "Those places help people, but they do not know people. You remembered everyone's names, everyone's stories. You made us feel like family." After Maria continued on her way, Margaret stood on the street corner feeling the full weight of what had been lost. Not just the building or the programs, but the relationships, the sense of community, the feeling that everyone mattered equally and belonged somewhere. Winter deepened, and Margaret's world grew smaller. Ice on the sidewalks made walking dangerous, heating bills consumed most of her monthly budget, and the arthritis in her hands made simple tasks like opening jars or buttoning coats increasingly difficult. She began spending most of her time in the apartment, venturing out only for necessities. The television became her primary companion, though she rarely found programs that held her interest. More often, she sat by her single window watching the activity in the alley below and remembering all the people who had once filled her life with purpose. Margaret's 72nd birthday came and went without celebration. She had not told anyone the date, and there was no one left who would have remembered anyway. She marked the day by eating a store-bought cupcake and looking through a photo album filled with pictures from the community center's years of operation. The faces in those photos seemed to mock her current situation. Children she had housed growing up safely in their new homes while she struggled to pay rent. Families she had helped through crisis building stable lives, while her own life had fallen apart. Volunteers she had worked with for years continuing their charitable efforts while she sat useless in a studio apartment. Margaret began to wonder if her years of service had meant anything at all. If the work had been truly important, would not someone have found a way to save the center? If she had made a real difference in people's lives, would not someone be checking on her now that she was the one who needed help? The doubt that crept into her thoughts during those long winter days was more devastating than any physical illness. Margaret had built her identity around being useful, being needed, being the person others could depend on. Without that role, she felt like she was disappearing a little more each day. Spring came late that year, and Margaret's health continued its downward trajectory. She had fallen twice in the apartment, once badly enough to leave bruises that took weeks to fade. Her appetite had diminished to the point where she was losing weight she could not afford to lose, and her energy levels made even simple tasks exhausting. The day that would change everything began like any other. Margaret had been feeling particularly weak and had not left her apartment in 3 days. She was out of food except for a can of soup that she could not open because her hands were too painful to operate the can opener. Standing in her tiny kitchen, Margaret stared at the soup can and felt something inside her break. This was what her life had become, a 72-year-old woman who had devoted her life to feeding others but could not feed herself. She sat down at her small table and let the tears come. All the grief she had held back during the months of financial crisis and health decline finally overwhelmed her. She cried for the center that was gone, for the people she could no longer help, for the future that held nothing but increasing limitations and deeper isolation. But mostly, she cried because she felt forgotten. By the families she had helped, by the volunteers she had worked with, by the God she had served faithfully for 7 decades. Margaret had given everything she had to making other people's lives better, and now she was facing the end of her own life with nothing to show for it but empty rooms and unpaid bills. As darkness fell that evening, Margaret made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would not wait for her health to deteriorate further or for her money to run out completely. She would not become a burden on the social services system she had once helped others navigate. Margaret put on her warmest coat and walked slowly down the 3 flights of stairs to the street. The evening air was cold enough to make her chest ache, but she barely noticed. She had a destination in mind, the old house on Maple Street where the community center had operated for 15 years. The walk took longer than it used to, and Margaret had to stop several times to rest. When she finally reached her old neighborhood, she stood across the street from the house that had once been the center of her world. A different family lived there now. The windows glowed with warm light, and she could see shadows of people moving around inside. Children's bicycles were scattered on the front lawn, and flower boxes had been added to the front porch. It looked like a happy home, which should have made Margaret glad. Instead, it made her feel like a ghost visiting a life that had never really belonged to her. Margaret walked around to the back of the property, where she had once grown a vegetable garden to supplement the community dinners. The garden was gone now, replaced with playground equipment and a deck with outdoor furniture. She sat down on the back steps where she had once sorted donations and planned menus for hundreds of people. The concrete was cold through her coat, and she could feel her energy fading as the night grew darker. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words would not come. She had prayed faithfully for 72 years, asking for strength to serve others, wisdom to help families in crisis, resources to keep the center running. But now, when she needed help herself, prayer felt as empty as her apartment. As she sat in the darkness behind the house where she had once been needed, Margaret felt her life force ebbing away like water from a broken cup. The cold was seeping into her bones, her chest was tight with each breath, and the exhaustion in her soul felt heavier than her body could carry. She was not sure how long she had been sitting there when she heard car doors slamming in the front driveway. Voices carried around the house, a man and woman talking quietly, their footsteps moving across the gravel. Margaret tried to stand up to leave before the homeowners discovered her trespassing, but her legs would not support her weight. She was trapped by her own weakness, about to be found like a vagrant on property that had once been her sanctuary. The footsteps grew closer, and Margaret heard the woman's voice more clearly. "I know this seems crazy, but I keep feeling like we are supposed to be here tonight." "The address matches," the man replied. "This is definitely where the Maple Street Community Center used to be." Margaret's heart began to race, though she could not understand why those words filled her with sudden hope. She remained frozen on the back steps as flashlight beams swept across the yard, growing brighter as the strangers approached. When the light found her, Margaret raised one trembling hand to shield her eyes. Behind the bright beam, she could barely make out 2 figures walking toward her. "Are you all right?" the woman called out, her voice filled with concern rather than anger. "We have been looking for you," the man added, and something in his tone made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. As they moved closer and the flashlight lowered, Margaret could see their faces clearly for the first time. The woman was about 30, with kind eyes and dark hair pulled back in a professional style. The man was slightly older, tall and well-dressed, with a familiar warmth in his expression that Margaret almost recognized. "Margaret Thompson," the woman asked gently, kneeling down beside the steps. "We found you." Margaret stared at their faces, her mind trying to process what was happening. After months of feeling forgotten and abandoned, strangers had appeared in her darkest hour, speaking her name like they had been searching for her. "I do not understand," Margaret whispered, her voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "Who are you?" The man stepped forward, and when he smiled, Margaret's heart stopped. She was looking at the face of a 6-year-old boy she had once fed with her own lunch, aged by 20 years, but still unmistakably familiar. "Tommy," she breathed, hardly daring to believe it was possible. "My name is Thomas Bennett now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And this is my sister Elizabeth Chen. We have been looking for you for a very long time." Margaret's world tilted as understanding crashed over her. The orphaned children she had loved and lost were standing in front of her as successful adults, and somehow they had found her at the moment when she most needed to be found. Beth. Margaret looked at the woman with new recognition, seeing the 8-year-old girl in her mature features. "How did you find me? How did you know I needed help?" Beth reached out and took Margaret's cold hands in her warm ones. "We never stopped looking for you. And when we read about the community center closing, we knew we had to find you before it was too late." As Thomas helped Margaret to her feet, and Beth wrapped a warm blanket around her shoulders, Margaret felt something she had not experienced in months, the sensation of being precious to someone, of mattering in a way that transcended her ability to save others. "Come on," Thomas said gently, supporting her weight as they walked toward the front of the house. "We have a lot to talk about, and we are not letting you out of our sight again." For the first time since losing everything, Margaret allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story was not ending. It was beginning a new chapter that she could never have written for herself. The black sedan parked in the driveway was unlike anything Margaret had seen in her neighborhood. Its chrome gleamed under the streetlight, and even in the darkness, she could tell the car cost more than most people made in a year. But what struck her most was not the vehicle's obvious expense. It was the gentle way Thomas helped her into the soft leather seats, as if she were made of precious glass. "Are you warm enough?" Elizabeth asked, adjusting the blanket around Margaret's shoulders as Thomas started the engine. Heat immediately began flowing from vents, chasing away the cold that had settled deep in Margaret's bones. "I still do not understand how you found me," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After all these years, how did you know where to look?" Thomas caught her eyes in the rearview mirror as he pulled away from the house on Maple Street. "We never stopped looking, Margaret. Beth and I have had a private investigator searching for you for the past 5 years." "But why?" Margaret asked, though even as the words left her mouth, she was afraid of the answer. Had she done something wrong during those 3 weeks when they lived with her? Had their adult selves discovered some flaw in her care that their child selves had not recognized? Elizabeth turned in the passenger seat to face Margaret directly. "Because you saved our lives, and we needed you to know what happened to us. We needed to thank you properly." "You do not need to thank me," Margaret said quickly. "I only did what anyone would have done." "No," Thomas said firmly, his voice carrying an authority that made Margaret look at him more carefully. "You did what almost no one would have done. And what you did changed everything for us." As they drove through Denver's quiet streets, Thomas and Elizabeth began to tell Margaret about the 20 years since she had last seen them. The story that unfolded was more remarkable than anything Margaret could have imagined. "The Hendersons were good people," Elizabeth said, speaking about her adoptive family. "They loved me and gave me every opportunity a child could want. But they never understood why I kept talking about my little brother and asking to see him." "The Garcias were wonderful too," Thomas added. 3 older brothers who taught me everything about sports and cars, parents who supported every dream I had. But there was always this emptiness where Beth should have been." Elizabeth continued the story, explaining how both families had initially agreed to maintain sibling contact, but had gradually allowed the visits to become less frequent and eventually stop altogether. The adoption counselors had assured both sets of parents that the children would adjust better, without constant reminders of their traumatic past. "By the time we were teenagers, we had not seen each other in almost 10 years, Thomas said, his voice heavy with old pain. "I used to lie awake at night wondering if Beth was okay, if she was happy, if she even remembered having a brother." "I never stopped looking for him," Elizabeth said quietly. When I turned 18 and could access my adoption records, Tommy was the first person I searched for. The reunion between the siblings had taken place when Elizabeth was in her second year of medical school and Thomas was finishing his degree in business administration. They had both been successful students, driven by an intensity that their adoptive families had attributed to their traumatic early years, but that they themselves understood differently. "We were driven because we remembered what you taught us," Elizabeth explained to Margaret. "That when someone shows you kindness, you pass it on to others." We both knew that our success was not just for ourselves, it was so we could help other people the way you helped us. Thomas had built a successful consulting business that specialized in helping small nonprofits become more sustainable and effective. Elizabeth had become a pediatrician with a focus on children in foster care. Both had accumulated wealth beyond anything their younger selves could have imagined, but both had also maintained the same generous hearts that Margaret remembered. "5 years ago, we decided it was time to find you," Thomas said as he turned onto the street where Margaret's apartment building stood. "We wanted to create a foundation in your honor, but we wanted your permission and your guidance." Margaret's mind struggled to process what she was hearing. "A foundation in my honor? But I lost everything. The community center failed. I could not even take care of myself, let alone help other people." "Margaret," Elizabeth said gently, "the community center did not fail. It succeeded beyond anything you could have imagined. Do you know how many people still talk about what that place meant to them? Do you know how many volunteers you trained who went on to start their own programs?" Thomas parked in front of Margaret's building and turned off the engine, but none of them moved to get out. "We have been researching your impact for years. The families you helped, the children you housed, the volunteers you inspired. Your influence has touched thousands of lives. But if that was true, why did no one help when I needed it?" Margaret asked, the question that had tormented her throughout the winter months. "Because you never asked," Elizabeth said simply. "You spent your entire life being the person who gave help, never the person who received it. Most people probably assumed you were fine, that someone with your strength and connections would land on her feet." Thomas reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a thick folder. "Margaret, we want to show you something. This is what we have been working on for the past 5 years." Even in the dim light from the street lamps, Margaret could see the professional quality of the documents Thomas handed her. The letterhead read the Margaret Thompson Foundation for Community Support in elegant script, and the pages detailed plans for a non-profit organization that would provide exactly the kind of help Margaret had once offered through her community center. "The foundation would operate differently than your center did," Elizabeth explained as Margaret turned through the pages with shaking hands. "We would focus on sustainability and growth, making sure the programs could continue indefinitely without depending on one person's sacrifice. We want to open community centers in 5 cities to start," Thomas added. "Places where families can find temporary housing, job training, childcare, educational support, everything you provided, but with proper funding and professional management." Margaret looked up from the papers, her eyes filling with tears. "This is beautiful, but I do not understand why you want my name on it. You two have built your own lives, achieved your own success. You do not need to be connected to my failures." "Margaret," Elizabeth said, her voice firm but loving, "what do you think we learned from you during those 3 weeks we lived in your house?" Margaret thought back to that time, trying to remember what lessons she might have taught 2 traumatized children. "I do not know. That there are people who will help you when you need it." "More than that," Thomas said. "You taught us that love is not about keeping people. It is about wanting what is best for them even when that means letting them go. You taught us that helping one person changes the world, because that person will help others," Elizabeth continued. "You taught us that kindness is not a feeling, it is a choice you make every single day. And you taught us," Thomas said, his voice growing thick with emotion, "that family is not about blood or adoption papers. Family is about who shows up when you need them most." Margaret sat in the back seat of the luxury car, surrounded by warmth and documents that detailed plans beyond her wildest dreams, and tried to understand that her life's work had not ended in failure, but had been transformed into something larger than she had ever imagined possible. "There's one more thing," Elizabeth said, reaching for another folder. "We found the house." "What house?" "The house on Maple Street," Thomas said. It went up for sale 6 months ago, and we bought it. The Foundation's first community center is going to be in the place where it all started for you. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The house where she had lived and worked for 15 years, where she had helped hundreds of families, where she had built the most meaningful part of her life, they were bringing it back. We want you to live there, Elizabeth said quietly. Not as a client or a beneficiary, but as the director emeritus of the Foundation. We need your wisdom, your experience, and your heart to guide what we are building. Thomas turned in his seat to look directly at Margaret. We know you are tired, and we know you have been through more than anyone should have to endure. But Margaret, your work is not finished. There are still people who need exactly what you have to offer. Margaret looked out the window at her apartment building, with its broken elevator and overflowing trash bins, then back at the two adults who had once been the hungry children she had fed with her own lunch. They were offering her not just rescue from her current circumstances, but purpose beyond anything she had dared to hope for. I do not know if I have the strength, she whispered. You do not have to have the strength, Elizabeth said, taking Margaret's hands in hers. You just have to have the willingness. We will provide everything else, the funding, the staff, the resources, the support. All you have to provide is the heart that taught us what love looks like. As Margaret sat in the car that represented success beyond her imagination, surrounded by people whose lives had been shaped by a turkey sandwich she had shared 20 years earlier, she felt something stirring in her chest that she had not felt in months. Hope. Not hope for herself, but hope for all the families still struggling in ways she understood, all the children still needing the kind of safety she knew how to create, all the communities still lacking the kind of support she had learned to provide. When do we start? Margaret asked, and for the first time in a year, her voice sounded strong. The ride back to the house on Maple Street felt like traveling through time. Margaret sat between Thomas and Elizabeth in the back seat of the sedan, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as familiar streets passed by the windows. Everything looked smaller than she remembered, but also more precious, as if seeing her old neighborhood through the lens of unexpected redemption had changed the way light fell on ordinary buildings and trees. Margaret, Elizabeth said as they pulled into the driveway of what had once been Margaret's home, we want you to know that we understand if this is overwhelming. We do not expect you to make any decisions tonight. But Margaret was already staring at the house with eyes that saw beyond its current state. The new family had taken good care of the property, but she could see past their renovations to the bones of the building that had sheltered so many people during their most desperate times. The basement, she said suddenly. Is the community room still there? We can show you, Thomas said, helping her out of the car. But first, there are some people who want to see you. As they walked toward the front door, Margaret noticed other cars parked along the street, vehicles she did not recognize, but somehow their presence felt purposeful rather than coincidental. Thomas used a key to unlock the front door, and Margaret stepped into a house that was both familiar and completely transformed. The living room was filled with people, and as Margaret's eyes adjusted to the light, she began to recognize faces that belonged to different chapters of her life. Mrs. Patterson stood by the fireplace, older but still wearing the warm smile Margaret remembered from their soup kitchen days. David Chen, her former accountant, was there with his wife and 2 children Margaret had never met. Pastor Richards sat in a corner chair, his hair completely white now, but his eyes as kind as ever. "Surprise," said a voice from the kitchen doorway, and Margaret turned to see Maria Santos, the mother with 3 children who had been among the last families to stay at the center before its closing. But Maria looked different now, healthier, more confident, wearing clothes that suggested stability rather than crisis. "I do not understand," Margaret said, looking around the room at faces both familiar and new. "How did you all?" "We have been planning this for months," Mrs. Patterson explained, walking over to give Margaret a hug that felt like coming home. "When Thomas and Elizabeth contacted us about finding you, we all wanted to be part of bringing you back to where you belong." Pastor Richards stood up from his chair, moving more slowly than Margaret remembered, but still carrying the gentle authority that had made him such an effective community leader. "Margaret, these young people have been telling us about their foundation plans, and frankly, we think they are brilliant. But more than that, we think they are exactly what you would have created if you had had unlimited resources." David Chen approached with a folder that looked similar to the ones Thomas had shown her in the car. Margaret, I have been doing the financial projections for the foundation. The funding they have secured is enough to operate 5 community centers for at least 10 years, with built-in mechanisms for sustainable growth. Margaret felt dizzy trying to process the information coming from all directions. These were people she had not seen in months or years, people she had assumed had moved on with their lives and forgotten about their connection to her work. Yet here they were, gathered in her old house, talking about future plans as if her opinion still mattered. "Sit down, Miss Margaret," Maria said, guiding her to the couch that now occupied the space where Margaret's old furniture had once been. "We have stories to tell you." What followed was an evening of revelations that redefined Margaret's understanding of her own impact. Maria explained how the job training program Margaret had connected her with had led to a career in social work. She was now helping other families navigate the systems that had once overwhelmed her, using skills and insights gained during her time at the community center. "You taught me that asking for help was not weakness, it was wisdom," Maria said. "Now I teach that to other mothers who are too proud or too scared to reach out when they need support." Mrs. Patterson shared how Margaret's approach to volunteer management had inspired her to organize similar programs at 3 other churches in Denver. "You never made volunteers feel like they were doing charity work," she explained. "You made us feel like we were building community, like everyone who came through those doors had something valuable to contribute." David Chen's story was perhaps the most surprising. After handling the center's books for years, he had been inspired to leave his corporate accounting job and start a non-profit consulting firm that helped small charitable organizations avoid the kind of financial crisis that had destroyed Margaret's center. "I learned from watching your mistakes as much as from watching your successes," he said with characteristic honesty. "You taught me that good intentions are not enough. You also need sustainable systems and proper oversight." One by one, people in the room shared stories of how their experience with Margaret and the community center had influenced the directions of their lives. A former volunteer who had become a teacher, specializing in working with homeless children. A family who had received help during a crisis and now organized annual charity drives for other families in need. A teenager who had attended after-school programs at the center and was now in college studying social work. "Margaret," Elizabeth said when the sharing had concluded, "do you see what we see? You did not lose everything when the center closed. You planted seeds that grew into something much larger than any single building or program." Thomas pulled out his phone and began showing Margaret photos and documents. "We have been documenting the ripple effects of your work for 5 years. We estimate that people directly touched by your community center have gone on to help more than 10,000 other people in various ways." Margaret stared at the photos on the phone screen. Families she recognized from her center volunteering at food banks, former clients who had become social workers or teachers, children who had grown up to start their own charitable efforts. The scope of secondary impact was overwhelming. "But I failed," Margaret said quietly, voicing the belief that had tormented her throughout her months of isolation. "I could not sustain what I built. I lost the house, I lost the programs, I left people without help when they needed it." Pastor Richards leaned forward in his chair, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had counseled people through countless crises. "Margaret, failure is not falling down. Failure is staying down when you have the opportunity to get back up." The center closed because it was not designed to last forever with one person carrying the entire burden, David added. "But the impact of the center was designed to last forever because you built it into the hearts and minds of everyone who experienced it." Elizabeth opened another folder and spread its contents across the coffee table. Margaret recognized financial documents, architectural plans, and legal papers, but the details were too complex for her to understand in her current emotional state. "This is our formal offer," Elizabeth said. "The Margaret Thompson Foundation will provide you with a house, a living stipend, medical coverage, and staff support. In exchange, we want you to serve as the Director Emeritus of our first community center, which will operate out of this house." Thomas pointed to specific sections of the documents. "You would not be responsible for day-to-day management or financial oversight. We would handle all of that. Your role would be to provide guidance on programs, mentor staff members, and be available to families who need the kind of personal attention you are so good at providing." Think of it as the best parts of what you used to do, without the parts that burned you out, Mrs. Patterson added with a smile. Margaret looked around the room at faces that represented different seasons of her life, people she had served, people who had served alongside her, and people who had been transformed by the experience of being part of something larger than themselves. These were not strangers offering charity to a desperate old woman. These were family members welcoming her back to where she belonged. "There's one more thing," Elizabeth said, reaching into her purse. "We found this in our adoption files." She handed Margaret a small object wrapped in tissue paper. Margaret unwrapped it carefully and found herself holding a tiny silver locket, the same locket she had given to Beth on their last night together 20 years earlier. The locket was tarnished with age and wear, but when Margaret opened it, the small photo of the three of them was still clearly visible. "I have carried this every single day since you gave it to me," Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. "Through high school, through college, through medical school, through my residency. Whenever I felt discouraged or overwhelmed, I would look at this picture and remember what you taught me about kindness and perseverance." Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small red toy car, the same car Margaret had given him on their last night together. "I kept this on my desk through business school and still keep it in my office now. It reminds me that the most valuable things in life are not things, they are relationships and the way we choose to treat each other." Margaret held the locket and the car, objects she had not seen in 20 years, and felt the full impact of what Thomas and Elizabeth were offering her. This was not rescue or charity. This was recognition of the value she had created and an invitation to continue creating it under conditions that would allow it to flourish. "When would this begin?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier than it had been all evening. "Tomorrow, if you are ready," Thomas said. "We have already prepared a bedroom for you upstairs, and the foundation's legal documents are complete. All we need is your signature and your commitment to let us love you the way you loved us." Margaret looked one more time around the room filled with people whose lives had been touched by her willingness to share a turkey sandwich with two hungry children. She thought about the months of isolation and despair she had endured, believing that her life's work had been meaningless and that she had been forgotten by everyone who had ever mattered to her. Now she understood that she had not been forgotten. She had been remembered so well that a community of people had conspired to bring her back to purpose and dignity. She had not failed in her mission to help others. She had succeeded so completely that her impact had multiplied far beyond anything she could have accomplished alone. "Yes," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, I want to come home. Yes, I want to continue the work. And yes, I want to help you build something that will last long after we are all gone." As the people in the room erupted in cheers and applause, Margaret felt something she had not experienced since before the community center's closing, absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, surrounded by exactly the right people to help her do it. The circle of kindness that had begun with a shared lunch 20 years earlier was finally complete, but it was also just beginning to expand into something none of them could yet imagine. Margaret woke up in her old bedroom for the first time in 2 years, and for a moment she forgot everything that had happened. The morning light came through windows she remembered, the sounds from the street were familiar, and the room itself felt like wrapping herself in a favorite blanket she had thought was lost forever. Then she remembered the evening before, the reunion, the foundation plans, the overwhelming realization that her story was beginning a new chapter rather than ending. She lay in bed for several minutes, testing whether the hope she felt was real or just an extension of a dream she had been afraid to have. A gentle knock on her bedroom door confirmed that everything was beautifully, impossibly real. "Margaret, are you awake?" Elizabeth's voice carried the same caring tone Margaret remembered from 20 years earlier, though now it came from a successful doctor rather than a frightened 8-year-old. "Come in, dear," Margaret called, sitting up in bed and reaching for the robe that someone, probably Elizabeth, had left folded on the chair beside her bed. Elizabeth entered carrying a breakfast tray with coffee, toast, and fruit arranged on dishes that Margaret recognized as her own, somehow saved from the foreclosure and returned to her. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Margaret answered honestly. "Elizabeth, how is this possible? Yesterday I thought my life was over, and today I feel like it is just beginning." "That is because it is just beginning," Elizabeth said, setting the tray across Margaret's lap and settling into the chair beside the bed. "Margaret, Thomas and I have been planning this moment for years. We knew that finding you was only the first step. We also had to create conditions that would allow you to thrive." As Margaret ate breakfast, Elizabeth explained the practical details of how the foundation would operate. Professional staff would handle administration, fundraising, and day-to-day management of programs. Margaret's role would be to provide the personal touch that had made her original center so effective, getting to know families individually, connecting them with resources, and creating the sense of community that transformed charity into belonging. "We have already hired a program director, a case manager, and a volunteer coordinator," Elizabeth said. "All of them have experience working in community nonprofits, and all of them specifically requested to work with this foundation because they heard about your approach to serving families." "Who are they?" Margaret asked, curious about the people who would be implementing her vision with professional training she had never possessed. "People who know your work," Elizabeth said with a smile. "The program director is Jennifer Martinez. She used to bring her children to your after-school programs when she was a single mother finishing college. Now she has a master's degree in social work and 15 years of experience managing community programs." Margaret remembered Jennifer, a young woman who had been overwhelmed by the demands of parenting two small children while attending classes full-time. The center had provided after-school care that allowed Jennifer to study in the library without worrying about her children's safety or supervision. "The case manager is Robert Kim. He was one of your volunteers during his college years and credits his experience at your center with his decision to pursue social work as a career." Margaret smiled, remembering the earnest young man who had helped with homework tutoring and had been especially good at connecting with teenagers who were aging out of foster care. "And the volunteer coordinator is someone you know very well," Elizabeth continued. "Mrs. Patterson decided that retirement was boring and asked if she could come back to work with you again." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Mrs. Patterson had been her closest partner in running the original center, and the thought of working alongside her again felt like a gift beyond description. After breakfast, Thomas arrived to give Margaret a tour of the house and explain how it had been renovated to serve as both a home and the foundation's first community center. The changes were thoughtful and extensive, designed to honor the building's history while making it more functional for its renewed purpose. "We kept the basement community room exactly as you had it," Thomas said as they descended the familiar stairs. "But we added a commercial kitchen that meets health department standards for serving large groups." Margaret gasped when she saw the basement space. Not only had they preserved the warm, welcoming atmosphere she had worked years to create, they had enhanced it with better lighting, more comfortable furniture, and technology that would allow for educational programs and job training classes. "The main floor will continue to serve as your private residence," Thomas continued as they toured the renovated first floor. "But we added an office where you can meet with families privately, and we converted the sunroom into a children's play area for families who are staying here temporarily." The most dramatic change was the addition of a second-floor apartment with 2 bedrooms, a kitchenette, and a sitting area. "This will provide temporary housing for families in crisis," Thomas explained. "Not as many as you used to accommodate, but with proper privacy and dignity." Margaret ran her hands along the walls of the new apartment, remembering all the families who had slept on couches and air mattresses throughout her house during the center's original incarnation. This was so much better, a solution that provided emergency housing while respecting people's need for personal space. "Thomas, this must have cost a fortune," Margaret said as they returned to the main floor. "It cost exactly what it needed to cost," Thomas replied. "Margaret, Beth and I are both very successful in our careers, but more than that, we have spent 20 years being motivated by the memory of what you did for us. Every business deal I have made, every career decision Beth has made, has been influenced by our commitment to eventually honor what you gave us." That afternoon brought Margaret's first official day as Director Emeritus of the Margaret Thompson Foundation. The title felt surreal, but the work felt like coming home. Her first task was meeting with the professional staff who would be implementing programs based on her experience and vision. Jennifer Martinez arrived promptly at 2 o'clock, and Margaret was struck by how much the young mother she remembered had matured into a confident professional. Jennifer's master's degree in social work was evident in her thorough understanding of current best practices, but her experience as a single mother gave her the empathy that no amount of education could provide. "Miss Margaret," Jennifer said, settling into the office chair across from Margaret's desk, "I have been dreaming about this opportunity for 10 years. Working with you taught me that social work is not about managing people's problems. It is about recognizing people's strengths and helping them build on those strengths." Robert Kim arrived a few minutes later, and Margaret was delighted to see how the serious college student she remembered had developed into a thoughtful professional with an easy smile and obvious passion for his work. "I have been following the research on your community center model for years," he said, pulling out a tablet filled with notes and data. "The family outcomes from people who received services here were significantly better than the statistical averages for similar programs. I want to understand what made the difference so we can replicate it." Margaret spent the afternoon sharing stories and insights from her years of community work, but she found herself learning as much as she was teaching. Jennifer and Robert had professional training that Margaret lacked, and they had been exposed to approaches and research that could make the new center even more effective than the original. The difference was not any special technique, Margaret explained in response to Robert's questions about her success rates. The difference was treating every person who came through that door as family. Not clients, not cases, not charity recipients, family. "Can you explain what that looked like in practice?" Jennifer asked, taking notes on her laptop. Margaret thought for a moment, trying to articulate something that had always felt intuitive to her. "Family means you remember people's names and their stories. Family means you celebrate their successes and worry about their problems. Family means you expect the best from them and offer help without judgment when they struggle. And family means you stay connected even after the immediate crisis is resolved," Robert added, understanding immediately what Margaret was describing. "Exactly. Some of the families I helped 20 years ago still send me Christmas cards. Not because they owe me anything, but because we became part of each other's lives in a way that mattered." That evening, Mrs. Patterson arrived for what she called the first real staff meeting of the new era. Margaret had been looking forward to this reunion all day, and Mrs. Patterson did not disappoint. She walked through the door carrying a casserole dish and wearing the same apron she had worn during their soup kitchen days. "Well, Margaret Thompson," Mrs. Patterson said, setting the casserole on the kitchen counter and giving Margaret a hug that lasted a full minute, "you certainly know how to make an entrance. Disappearing for a year, and then showing up with a foundation named after you and 2 successful children who turned into fairy godparents." Margaret laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I had no idea any of this was going to happen. Yesterday, I was eating soup from a can because I could not open it myself. And today you are back where you belong, with people who appreciate what you have to offer and resources to make it sustainable this time." Mrs. Patterson began unpacking supplies from a large tote bag. "I brought everything we need to start planning our first community dinner. Nothing too fancy, just 150 people." 150. Margaret asked, startled by the number. "Word travels fast in this community," Mrs. Patterson explained. "As soon as people heard the center was reopening, they started calling to ask when they could come back. Families who received help here, volunteers who used to work here, neighbors who missed having this place as the heart of the community." As they planned the menu and logistics for the following week's dinner, Margaret felt a familiar energy returning to her body and spirit. This was what she had been created to do, bring people together around tables where everyone was welcome and everyone belonged. "Margaret," Mrs. Patterson said as they finished their planning, "there's something I need you to understand. When this place closed, it left a hole in this community that never got filled. Other organizations provided services, but no one else provided belonging. You are not just getting a second chance. This community is getting a second chance too." That night, as Margaret settled into her restored bedroom in her restored house surrounded by restored purpose, she reflected on the miraculous transformation her life had undergone in less than 24 hours. She thought about Beth and Tommy, now Elizabeth and Thomas, who had somehow turned their childhood gratitude into an adult mission to honor the woman who had shown them kindness during their darkest time. She thought about the professional staff who would help her build programs that could serve more people more effectively than she had ever managed alone. She thought about Mrs. Patterson, who had chosen to come out of retirement to be part of something that mattered more than personal comfort. Most of all, she thought about the families who were already planning to return to a place where they had once found help and hoped to find it again. Tomorrow, her real work would begin, not the desperate improvisation of her earlier years, but the thoughtful, well-supported effort to create lasting change in people's lives. Margaret fell asleep that night with a prayer of gratitude on her lips and the absolute certainty that the best chapters of her story were still being written. 6 months after Margaret's return to Maple Street, the house once again hummed with the activity of families in transition, volunteers with servant hearts, and children who had found a safe place to grow. But this time, the chaos was organized, the programs were sustainable, and Margaret herself was thriving instead of burning out. The first Margaret Thompson Community Center had become a model that was already being replicated in other cities. Thomas and Elizabeth had kept their promise to expand the foundation's reach, with centers opening in Portland, Austin, and Boston, each staffed by professionals who had trained at the original Maple Street location. Margaret's typical day began with breakfast in her own kitchen, followed by a walk through the house to greet whoever was staying in the upstairs apartment. This morning, it was the Johnson family, a mother with 3 young children who had been evicted from their previous housing while waiting for disability benefits to begin after a car accident. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," Margaret said, knocking gently on the apartment door. "How did everyone sleep?" "Much better than we have in weeks," replied Sarah Johnson, opening the door with baby Emma on her hip and the 2 older children peering around her legs. "Miss Margaret, I cannot thank you enough for letting us stay here while we wait for the housing assistance to come through." "You do not need to thank me, dear. This is what this place is for." Margaret knelt down to the children's eye level. "Are you ready for school today, Michael and Sophie?" The children nodded eagerly. One of the new center's most popular programs was providing transportation to ensure that children in temporary housing did not have to change schools during their family's crisis periods. Jennifer Martinez had designed the program based on research showing how school stability improved long-term outcomes for children experiencing homelessness. After seeing the Johnson children off to school, Margaret made her way to the basement community room, where the morning job training program was in session. Robert Kim was leading a workshop on interview skills, with 12 adults practicing their responses to common questions, while their younger children played in the adjacent childcare area. Margaret did not interrupt the formal program, but she made eye contact with each participant and offered the kind of encouraging smile that had become her signature. These small gestures of personal recognition made the difference between people feeling like clients in a program and feeling like valued members of a community. At 10 o'clock, Margaret's favorite part of the day began: individual meetings with families who were seeking help. Her role was not to make official determinations about eligibility or benefits. That was handled by professional staff. Her role was to listen to stories, understand needs, and help people feel heard and valued. Her first appointment was with Maria Santos, whose own transformation from client to social worker had become one of the Foundation's most inspiring success stories. Maria now worked for the city's Family Services Department, but still visited the center regularly to share her expertise and to maintain her connection with the place that had changed her life. "Miss Margaret, I wanted to update you on the advocacy program," Maria said, settling into the chair across from Margaret's desk. "We now have 12 former clients who are trained to help other families navigate the social services system." The P-Advocacy program had been Maria's idea, recognizing that people who had successfully worked through crisis situations could provide guidance and support to families facing similar challenges. The program had been so successful that other organizations throughout Denver were asking to replicate it. "How are the advocates feeling about their roles?" Margaret asked. "Empowered," Maria said without hesitation. "For most of them, this is the first time since their crisis that they have felt useful instead of needy. Being able to help others has been as healing for them as receiving help was originally." Margaret nodded, understanding exactly what Maria meant. She had learned long ago that the opportunity to serve others was often more transformative than the opportunity to receive services. At noon, the community dining room filled with the usual mix of people: families receiving temporary housing, elderly neighbors who lived alone and appreciated both the company and the nutrition, volunteers who stayed to eat with the people they served, and community members who paid for their meals as a way of supporting the center's programs. Margaret moved through the dining room with the easy grace of someone who had been hosting community meals for 20 years. She knew everyone's names, remembered details about their children and their struggles, and had a way of making each person feel like the most important guest at the table. "Miss Margaret," called out 10-year-old Carlos, whose family had been staying at the center for 3 weeks while his father recovered from a workplace injury, "will you sit with us today?" Margaret joined Carlos and his younger sister at their table, listening as they chatted about their school day and shared their excitement about their father's improving health. These were the moments that reminded her why she had devoted her life to this work, the privilege of witnessing ordinary families navigate extraordinary challenges with grace and determination. After lunch, Margaret walked upstairs to her private office to handle the administrative aspects of her role. The paperwork was minimal now. Thomas and Elizabeth had hired sufficient staff to manage most of the bureaucratic requirements, but she still reviewed applications from families seeking help and provided input on difficult cases. Her afternoon appointment was with a family she had never met before, the Hendersons, who had called the center asking for help with their teenage daughter. Margaret recognized the name immediately. These were the people who had adopted Beth 20 years earlier. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reviewed their intake form. Beth, now Dr. Elizabeth Chen, had maintained minimal contact with her adoptive family over the years, a situation that Margaret had always felt partially responsible for. The Hendersons had been good people who had loved Beth genuinely, but they had never understood her need to maintain connection with her brother and with Margaret. When the Hendersons arrived for their appointment, Margaret was struck by how much they had aged and how much sadness they carried in their faces. They explained that their daughter Beth had become successful and independent, but had remained emotionally distant from them, especially after reuniting with her brother. "We know she volunteers with your foundation," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carefully controlled. "And we know you were important to her before she came to live with us. We were hoping you might help us understand how to rebuild our relationship with her." Margaret chose her words carefully, understanding that she was in a delicate position. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, Beth loves you both very much, but she has never felt that you understood the importance of her relationship with her brother. We thought it would be easier for her to adjust to our family if she did not keep looking backward," Mr. Henderson explained. "The adoption counselors told us that maintaining old attachments could interfere with forming new ones." "I understand why you made that choice," Margaret said gently. "But for Beth and Tommy, their relationship with each other was not an old attachment. It was the foundation of their survival. Asking her to give that up felt like asking her to give up part of herself." The conversation that followed was difficult, but healing. Margaret helped the Hendersons understand that Beth's loyalty to her brother had never been a rejection of them, and she helped them see how they could support her adult relationships while still maintaining their own connection with her. "Would you be willing to help us reach out to her?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "We want to try again, but we are not sure she will be open to it." "I think she would be very open to it," Margaret replied. "But you might be surprised by what she needs from you now." That evening brought the center's weekly community meeting, where residents, volunteers, and neighbors gathered to discuss programs, share concerns, and celebrate successes. Margaret had learned from her earlier experience that community input was essential for creating programs that truly met people's needs. Tonight's meeting included an announcement that filled Margaret with pride and gratitude. The foundation had received a major grant that would allow them to expand their services to include a children's early learning program and a senior citizen support program. "This means we will be serving people from birth to old age," Jennifer Martinez explained to the gathered group. "We will be able to support entire families and entire communities in ways we never could before." As Margaret listened to the excited discussions about new programs and expanded services, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 20 years ago, she had shared her lunch with 2 hungry children, never imagining that this simple act would eventually result in a foundation that would touch thousands of lives. After the meeting, Margaret sat in her living room with Elizabeth and Thomas, who had driven down from their respective cities to attend the foundation's monthly board meeting the following day. The conversation turned, as it often did, to memories of their 3 weeks together when they were children. "Margaret," Elizabeth said, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not given us that sandwich at the soup kitchen?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "I think you both would have found your way to success anyway. You had strong hearts and brilliant minds even as children. But we would not have found our way back to each other," Thomas said. "And we would not have learned that helping others is the most important thing you can do with whatever success you achieve. You taught us something that most people never learn," Elizabeth added, "that the point of being blessed is to be a blessing to others." As the evening grew late and Elizabeth and Thomas prepared to return to their hotel, Margaret walked them to the front door of the house that had been the center of so many transformations, her own, theirs, and hundreds of other families who had found help and hope within its walls. "Margaret," Thomas said as they stood on the front porch, "do you remember what you told us on our last night together 20 years ago? You said that even if we forgot your name or your face, you hoped we would remember how it felt to be loved." "I remember," Margaret said. "We never forgot," Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. "And because we remembered, we have been able to love others the same way. Our children, our patients, our clients, our communities. We have tried to love them all the way you loved us." Margaret hugged them both, these two successful adults who had once been hungry children, and felt the deep satisfaction of understanding that her life had mattered in ways that would echo through generations. The children Elizabeth and Thomas would raise, the patients Elizabeth would heal, the communities Thomas would strengthen, the people their foundation would serve, all of it connected back to a turkey sandwich shared on a cold day in Denver 20 years earlier. After they left, Margaret walked through the quiet house, turning off lights and checking on the Johnson family sleeping peacefully in their temporary home upstairs. In the basement community room, she straightened chairs and picked up toys, preparing for another day of serving people who needed exactly what this place had always provided, not just services, but belonging. Standing in the room where so many community dinners had been served, so many families had found hope, and so many volunteers had discovered the joy of service, Margaret offered a prayer of gratitude for the unexpected grace that had brought her life full circle. She had learned that kindness was never wasted, that love planted in the right heart could grow into something magnificent, and that sometimes the end of one story was actually the beginning of a much larger story that would continue long after she was gone. The Margaret Thompson Community Center would serve families for decades to come, but more importantly, it would continue to create the kind of people who understood that everyone deserves help when they need it and everyone has something valuable to contribute when they are able. Margaret turned off the last light and climbed the stairs to her bedroom, where she would sleep peacefully in the house that had become home to so many people, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to show strangers the same kindness that two children had returned to her 1,000-fold.